Mishnah Brachot. Ein omdim lehitpalel ela mitoch koved rosh. One should not pray, or we do not stand to pray unless we have koved rosh, literally a heavy head. Chasidim harishonim hayu shohim sha'a achat u'mitpalalim. The early pious ones would tarry for 1 hour, perhaps meditate or breathe, shohim, for 1 hour before they would rise to pray, kedei sheyikavnu et libam lamakom, so that they could direct their hearts to God. Even if a king were to greet him, he may not return the greeting. Even if a snake were to be curled on his heel, he may not interrupt. This is a fabulous text. Let's unpack this line by line. Ein omdim lehitpalel. We do not rise to pray. When the rabbis of the Talmud talk about tefillah, prayer, they're referring to the Amidah, the standing silent prayer. This prayer that we say 3 times a day, which is the center of our prayer service. And here in the Mishnah, the rabbis are saying we shouldn't jump into the Amidah, right? Prayer is not something, it's not fast food. We can't just rush in, recite the Amidah and rush out. The early pious ones would actually shohim, I'm going to translate this as meditate. They would do some sort of a preparation for an hour before they would rise to recite the Amidah. And they did this in order to establish what we call kavanah. Kavanah really means intention or focus or concentration. It has also come to mean the inner spiritual meaning of what you do. In order for them to be able to concentrate and focus and have deep inner meaning to their prayer, they couldn't just rise to pray automatically. They had to prepare for a full hour. And then once they were in that state of the Amidah, of standing before God, nothing would distract you from your prayers. Because what are you doing? You are standing before God, right? This is serious business. The rabbis imagine, and the way they talk about the Amidah is they imagine that prayer is an encounter with God, and the metaphor for them is always that God is king on a throne. So when we rise to pray and we take our 3 steps forward and we bow, it's as if we are entering the divine throne. We are approaching the divine king, and we are standing before the king of the universe, which is why if a king of England, right, or a prime minister of Israel were to walk into the room, it doesn't matter. I'm talking to the king of the universe. Right? This is serious business. The rabbis were constructing a system for how we could stand before God. Now we're in the rabbinic period, and the rabbis are constructing a system where every human being can have access to God. Every human being can enter the divine throne. But it's still serious business, and we have to rise to pray with koved rosh. Now, how are we to understand what a heavy head means? It's often translated as a mood of reverence, a mood of seriousness. The rabbis of the Talmud that are trying to interpret this Mishnah, they come up with a lot of different suggestions and sources for how to understand this expression of heavy head, because it's a strange expression. And the first example that they give as they try to understand the Mishnah and what it means to have a heavy head in prayer, the very first example they give is the example of Hanna. This is a story in Tanakh, in the scriptures, in the book of Samuel. Hanna, like many of our matriarchs, many of the women in the Bible, is infertile. She's barren. And every year she comes to the temple in Shiloh with her husband and her husband's other wife, who's like fertile myrtle. She's got lots of kids. And poor Hanna is barren. And every year she comes with this pain. And one year in the story in the book of Samuel, she enters the temple and she pours out her soul before God in the bitterness of her spirit, and she begs God to give her a child. And the rabbis of the Talmud, when they try to understand what it means to rise in prayer with a heavy head, their first suggestion is, it's like Hanna. Just as Hanna prayed with this marat nefesh, with this bitterness of spirit, with this despondency, with this seriousness, this desperation, this dejection, that's kind of what our stance should be like when we stand to pray. It's a very serious business. Now, the rabbis go on to offer other examples, and eventually they choose other examples, but all of the examples they give to understand the meaning of koved rosh, heavy head, are examples about fear or seriousness or sadness. And so from this perspective and from this text, you might make the case that the religious stance and the religious posture in prayer is a posture of surrender, a posture of submission. In fact, when Rashi translates koved rosh in his commentary, he says that koved rosh is hachna'ah, surrender. That's the mood we should establish when we rise to pray. We should establish a mood of surrender. So let's look now at one of my all-time favorite texts, a remarkable text in the Talmud about prayer, and it's actually about Hanna. Love this one. Listen to what the rabbis do with Hanna. Now remember, the rabbis are doing a midrash. They're doing an interpretation of a biblical story, and they're going to go line by line through the biblical story of Hanna, and they're going to interpret and learn something from each line. So they start this whole discourse about Hanna, and they start by saying, oh, how many important laws can be learned from these verses related to Hanna. Now, we can almost stop there. This is pretty remarkable. They're going to learn halacha l'maseh, practical normative laws about prayer from Hanna. Right? I have to just say as an aside, pretty remarkable that the rabbis choose a woman as the model for the laws of prayer, when according to most perspectives, the rabbinic system does not understand that women are even obligated to daily prayer. But they pick Hanna as the model for how they're going to structure their halachot about prayer. And they say, now, Hanna hi medaberet al liba. In the biblical story, it says when she went into that temple, she was speaking in her heart, right? This deep, heartfelt prayer that she was pouring forth to God. Mikan, from here, say the rabbis, we learn that one who prays must direct one's heart towards God. The Hebrew here is ikaven et liba lemakom, which is very similar language to the Mishnah, which said that we have to establish koved rosh, we have to establish a heavy head, and that the early pious ones would meditate for an hour so that they could yikavnu et libam lemakom, that they could direct their hearts to God. And the rabbis say, where do we learn that we need to direct our hearts to God, that we need to have kavanah in prayer, that we need to have concentration and inner focus? We learn it from Hanna, because Hanna's prayer was so heartfelt. And that's how we should all pray. They go on. In the biblical story, it says that her lips were moving when she prays. From here we learn that one who prays must pronounce the words with his lips. So those of you who have observed in synagogue that when we say the Amidah, right, people's lips are moving. Where do we get that from? According to the rabbis of the Talmud, we get it from Hanna. Moving on, but her voice was not heard. Again, they're quoting from the biblical story. When Hanna went into the temple, her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Mikan, from here, we learn that it is forbidden to raise one's voice during prayer. It's a silent Amidah. Where do we learn that our Amidah should be silent? Again, we learn it from Hanna. Hanna teaches us to have kavanah, to have inner devotion when we pray. She teaches us to move our lips, but not to have any sound come out. So the first point is, wow, the rabbis choose Hanna as their model for prayer. But the real point I want to make is the continuation of this text. What do the rabbis do with the character of Hanna? How do they take this biblical story of this despondent, desperate, barren woman who goes into a temple and pours out her heart before God? And by the way, she's so desperate that she says to God, oh, if you give me a son, I'll give him back to you as a sacrifice. I'll dedicate him to the temple, which she does. when she gives birth to Samuel, after she weans him, she gives him up to the temple because she promised that to God. So the biblical story is really, at face value, a story of a desperate woman who is really in a posture of submission and surrender before God. But the rabbis paint a very different picture of her. And she made a vow and said, Adonai Tzvaot, Lord of hosts, or Master of legions. Rebbe Elazar said, from the day that the Holy One, blessed be He, created the universe, there was no person who called the Holy One, blessed be He, Adonai Tzvaot, Master of legions, until Hanna arrived and called him Master of legions. What did she intend from this form of address? Hanna said before the Holy One, blessed be He, Master of the universe, from all of the legions upon legions of creatures that you have created in your universe, Kasheh be'einecha, is it difficult in your eyes to grant me one son? So the rabbis notice in the biblical story of Hanna that the name she uses for God is a unique name that no one else has ever used before. Adonai Tzvaot, she's the first person to coin that expression to address God. And then that becomes the springboard for this midrash. Why did she call God Dafka, necessarily, particularly that name? What was the meaning behind that name for God? And for the rabbis, the meaning behind that name is that Hanna was, what did you say? Shatui. She was in his face, and she was, in some ways, shaming God. You're the master of hosts. You're the master of legions. You've created legions upon legions, every species, every tree, every fish, every human. Is it so difficult in your eyes to give me one son? Is that hard for you, God? And they go on to say an analogy. The rabbis love to give a limashal, an analogy, and the analogy always involves a king. And we know who the king is in the metaphors. By way of analogy, to what does this matter to be compared? To a king of flesh and blood who made a feast for his servants. A poor person came and stood by the door, and he said to them, give me a piece of bread. But they paid him no heed. And he pushed his way in and entered until he was in the proximity of the king. And he said to the king, my lord, the king, out of this entire feast that you have made, is it difficult in your eyes to give me one piece of bread? Again, so the rabbis are imagining that when Hanna addresses God, she's confronting God. And she's, in some ways, shaming God. God, you've made this incredible banquet in all of this creation, and I'm just a poor person asking for a little crumb. Is it so hard to give me a little piece of bread? Now let's keep reading, because you'll see as we put together all these pieces of the Midrash, we're starting to create the image of a religious personality in prayer. The rabbis are creating this image. These are the creative stories that they are weaving about Hanna. And it tells us a lot about their understanding of the religious stance and posture in prayer. So they go on. This next one's quite shocking. Goes on, and the rabbis notice that in the biblical story of Hanna, that it says, if you take note, im ra'ot hir'eh, if you take note of the suffering of your maidservant, ... In the actual biblical story, it says, if you take note of me and give me a son, I'll give him back to you as a sacrifice. But the rabbis are never wed to the concrete meaning of the text, right? They see the doubling of this verb, ra'ot hir'eh, which in biblical grammar is just a way of emphasizing something. If you surely take note. But the rabbis see there's a doubling of the verb, and so they use that as a springboard for this midrash. Why is it repetitive? Because Rabbi Elazar said, Hanna said before the Holy One, blessed be He, Master of the universe, Im ra'o, if you take note of my suffering and grant me a child, great, good. But if not, tir'eh, if not, you will take note. Why? Because I will go and seclude myself with another man in front of my husband Elkanah, and when I seclude myself, they will give me to drink the water of the sota, and you will not belie your Torah. For it is stated with regard to an innocent woman who drinks the sota waters, Then she shall be proven innocent, and she shall bear seed. Unbelievable. I mean, what can we say about this text? What's happening? First of all, interesting that the rabbis, in the voice of a woman, use a ritual of sota, which is not our most, feminist ritual of the Torah, and they turn it into a tool for this barren woman to get what she wants and to, in a sense, force God's hand. What is the sota ritual in Numbers chapter 5? In Numbers chapter 5, it says, if a woman is suspected of adultery, her jealous husband can bring her to the high priest in Jerusalem, who makes a potion, forces her to drink it, and if she's guilty, her stomach explodes. She gets harmed in some way, and then she's punished, and we know that she's guilty. If she's innocent, she drinks the potion, nothing happens to her, and she bears seed, which maybe could mean she gets pregnant, or at least she's capable of getting pregnant. Now, Hanna says, this is what I'm going to do, God. If you listen to me and take note of me and give me a child, great. But if you don't, you will, because I will go into a room alone with another man in order to make my husband jealous. Of course, I won't do anything in that room. I'll be innocent. But my husband will be jealous enough to bring me to the temple, and I'll drink the waters of sota. And since I will be innocent, what has to happen in order for you to live up to your promise in the Torah, in your own words? I'll bear seed. Ingenious, right? Ingenious, but so chutzpahdik. Here's a woman who's not only, kind of guilting God and shaming God. I'm just a poor person. I just need one crumb. But here she's actually threatening God. And then finally, I've selected from a series of midrashim, but this is one of my favorite. Now, Hanna v'himera beret al liba. Hanna was speaking in a heartfelt way. She was speaking from the heart. But the Hebrew says al liba, strange preposition, that she was speaking on her heart. That's strange. So the rabbis say, why does it say al liba, that she was speaking upon her heart? Rabbi Elazar related in the name of Rabbi Yossi ben Zimra that Hanna's plea made reference to matters that were physically on her heart. She said before him, Master of the universe, of all that you created in a woman, you didn't create a single thing for naught. You created eyes to see, ears to hear, a nose to smell, a mouth to speak, hands with which to work, feet with which to walk, and breasts with which to nurse. Dadim halalu shnatata b'libi lama. These breasts that you have placed upon my heart, why? What are they for? Lo lahanik bahen? Are they not there to nurse a child with? Right? Grant me a child that I may nurse with them. Again, you see both the chutzpah and the creativity and the ingenuity of Hanna. She tries every tactic to persuade God to give her what she wants. God, you're such a great, masterful creator, and you created everything for a purpose. So you have to give me a child to fulfill your own vision for creation. Hanna seems to me in this midrash to be very much like Abraham in Genesis 18, right? Someone who's willing to confront authority, to stand up for her rights, to speak honestly, openly, because it suggested that prayer is not only about standing in humility and surrender and awe, but that prayer can also be aggressive. Prayer can also be about asserting your rights. Theology of Covenant'el Intimacy before God. That to stand before God means that you can be fully yourself. You can stand before God and be who you are, with your pain, with your anger, with your needs, with your desires, and that God is there to accept us in our full humanness, which includes, in this case, our anger, our rage, our desperation, and our pain. One of the reasons I love this text is also because of when we read the story of Hanna. Does anyone remember when we read the story of Hanna in the Jewish calendar? Rosh Hashanah. We read the Haftarah of Hanna on Rosh Hashanah. And for me, every Rosh Hashanah that I read the Haftarah of Hanna, I think about the state of prayer in North American Judaism, though I imagine this was the state of prayer for thousands of years, which is that people come to the services of Rosh Hashanah. Sometimes people are only coming to synagogue once or twice a year. And the liturgy of Rosh Hashanah is so daunting. It's so long. It's so foreign. And how are we to find our place and stand before God on Rosh Hashanah? I imagine the rabbis talking in my ear and saying, we learn how to pray from Hanna. Just as Hanna, a woman, walked into the temple of Shiloh. She walked into the domain of a man. She wasn't a priest. She didn't have access or status or really the standing or the right to officiate at the temple service. But she just went in and poured out her heart before God. And I think similarly, when we enter the synagogue on Rosh Hashanah, we may not be comfortable with the Hebrew. We may not know all of the liturgy. We may not be ordained rabbis who can lead the service, but we can have this story of Hanna, this role model of a person who can walk in and just be herself before God and pour out her heart before God and speak her truth and her inner spirit before God.